I was just a child when this story happened. My parents were divorcing, but my father had always been violent. As he was not looking for an apartment himself and was very demanding, he lived with us during the divorce. One evening, though, I really had the fear of my life put into me. My mother had put my sisters and I to bed early. I always had trouble sleeping because I would hear my father yelling insults at my mother for hours and hours on end. Apparently, he didn't understand why she wanted to leave him. It was obvious, but narcissists generally don't recognize their own mistakes. They think they're completely perfect. That evening, it must have been almost midnight. I was just about starting to doze off when another howl woke me up. This time, it was my mother. My sisters and I got up and ran. We found my mother crying on the stairway. My father had hit her so hard that her head had slammed against the wall. She was screaming at him not to touch her. We immediately rushed towards her to surround and protect her. I was 9 years old, but even I understood. After all, I'd always been afraid of my father. He always hurt us. I was afraid of him, but I refused to leave my mother at his mercy. We took my mother to her room, while my older sister stopped my father from going upstairs. He kept saying she was hysterical and crazy. Above all, he didn't even recognize it was him who was causing all these problems. My mother was having trouble calming down and told us to get dressed quickly. When my father saw us coming back down all dressed to go out, he started insulting her again, asking where she was taking us. As if she had to tell him. Afraid that he might decide to hurt one of us, she told him she was taking us to McDonald's to get our mind off things. She took her coat and put us in the car before driving off. She didn't go in the direction of fast food at all, though. She drove around the city, parking in a parking lot I'd never seen before. From there, she guided us on foot to the city center, to the police station. It had been too much. She had seen the hatred in his eyes. He would have beaten her to death if we hadn't arrived in that moment. Not that we knew that at the time. Just as we arrived at the gate of the police station, we saw my father. He was coming out of the park right across the street. He had been searching for us. Unfortunately, he had just found us. We rushed inside, and seeing our panic, a policewoman took us to an office. As she closed the door, we heard my father enter the building and start hurling insults, asking where my mother was, while calling her names. He said she had nothing against him, that she didn't have the right to take us away, that kind of thing. We could hear him screaming like that for a whole hour. I was crying in my mother's arms. My older sister was shaking in fear. My other sister was the only one who was able to speak and tell the officer who'd stayed with us everything that happened. After a while, my dad finally left. The police station became suddenly very silent. Another policewoman poked her head in through the door and asked us if he had been drinking. The worst part was he never drank. He was just like that normally. The police explained to us that they had told my father to take his things and leave. They made us stay on their premises for a while making sure he had left and taking my mother's statement. My mother, however, still wanted to take us to fast food before going home. My sister absolutely wanted her cell phone back, which she had forgotten to take in a panic. The police officers were very reassuring. They asked us to call them urgently if my father came back, and then we were able to head home. When we arrived, the house was silent. Everything was turned off, and my father's car was no longer there. Relieved, my mother asked my sister to hurry up and grab her phone while we waited in the car. She took the keys and ran towards the house, but when she got to the door and opened it, she let out a scream of terror. My mother panicked and opened the car door to get out before seeing my father running furiously towards her. She just had enough time to tuck her leg back in before he slammed the door against it. She then had the reflex to lock all the doors, although she was worried about my sister outside. He started yelling again. He pulled on the handles and smacked against the car. This lasted about 10 minutes before sirens came to interrupt my father. 2 police cars and a police van arrived in front of our house. My sister had run into her room and called the police on her forgotten cell phone, which she'd come to get in the first place. My father still blamed my mother all the while, screaming that she dared to call the cops even though she had been in front of him all this time. The police almost jumped out of their vehicles, hands ready at their batons. One of them pinned my father against the car and handcuffed him, asking him why he was still there, and reminding him he'd been told to leave. My father was no longer proud. The only excuse he could come up with was that he couldn't find his underwear. The police stayed while he finally packed his things and left. They waited until he got into his car, which he had hidden around the corner, and watched as he drove away. They reassured my mother they were going to make rounds all night. My mother thanked them, and we left the neighborhood to finally go to the promised restaurant. Only when we arrived at the neighboring street, my father's car, which had been hiding, pulled right onto the road to follow behind us. What he had not expected, however, for some reason, was that the police van was escorting us. When we arrived at the restaurant, my father continued straight on the main road and left the city altogether, while the police made 3 laps around the McDonald's, provoking many questions from all the customers. Once we returned, we were afraid he would still be waiting for us, but as promised, the police kept watch all night, and he did not return. Needless to say, we didn't sleep a wink that night though, and had great difficulty sleeping for several weeks after. I've been an insomniac ever since, and today, at 28 years old, I still can't sleep without sleeping pills. Hello everyone, let me introduce myself. My name is Tony and I live in Paris. I decided this summer, with the health crisis and all, to stay in France and go south for the holidays. Going to the PACA region more precisely. Unfortunately, it didn't exactly go as planned. I'm going to tell you this story so that everyone can realize that you have to be wary of everyone at all times, especially if you're going to a place where you don't know anyone. Like I'd said, my girlfriend and I decided to go to the PACA region for the holidays. We rented an apartment on Airbnb. It wasn't the first time we'd rented on this platform, and so far it had always gone quite well. We were able to see different photos of the apartment, so we were sure of our choice, especially since the apartment was in a private residence in the city center. As you know, you can see the photo of the owner of the rental property as well, except this one, there was no photo. To avoid having too many problems, we'll call the owner Paul. On the day of departure, my girlfriend and I were super happy to discover everything in the region. The trip was going great so far. We'd arrived a little bit early, and so we decided to tour the city a bit before we could check into the apartment at 6 p.m. At around 5:30, we headed over to the address. I parked my car on the street where the residence was located. We received a message from Paul, who told us he would arrive in 10 minutes. 10 minutes passed by and we arrived in front of the entrance to the residence. The man got out of his car and called out to us. "Hey, you the guys that rented my apartment?" I instinctively answered yes, asking him if he was really Paul. After all, there was no photo provided. The man in front of me said yes, and we were reassured. The man was quite well dressed and didn't seem to be acting suspicious at all. He took us over to his apartment. We passed through the exterior parking lot of the residence before arriving in front of the building in question. The apartment was on the 3rd floor, and there was an elevator up to it. My first observation was that the apartment was slightly different from what had been represented in the photos. It wasn't like shockingly different or anything. It basically could have amounted to a simple change in decorations. The second observation was we wouldn't have thought the apartment was for rent at all, for several reasons. There were crumbs on the table, there were dishes stored in the sink, and things scattered all around. It looked as if someone was living there permanently, not renting it out to tourists. To tell you the truth, that didn't really worry me though. I told myself it was possible that Paul lived here and rented his apartment whenever he went out from time to time. That in itself was not super weird. I didn't care that the apartment wasn't too clean. We were going to be out enjoying our vacation anyway. That really should have caught my attention though. There was one thing that alerted and warned me now though. Paul's behavior became quite strange as soon as we entered the premises. Why, you ask? Well, because he had very specific rules on where we could pack our things away. For example, in the bedroom there was this small shelf with storage drawers. Paul told us that was where we should store our wallets and valuable jewelry. In fact, his tone of voice encouraged us to put our valuables there right now, as if he needed to know where we were going to be storing these precious belongings. Paul also began asking us more and more personal questions. Did we have any family here? Did we know the surroundings well? Was it our first time here? Did we live far away? At the time, I replied we did have family here, even though we didn't at all. My instincts were telling me to be wary of this person. Even though I'm telling you this in a lot of detail, you have to remember that I only noticed all these things in a couple of minutes max. It was a first glance sort of thing. If you were not a paranoid person, I don't think you'd really think anything was that abnormal about this situation. The worst was yet to come though. The tour was about to end and Paul had to leave the keys with us. Before he left, I had the strong urge to go to the bathroom, so my girlfriend stayed to talk with Paul. I go to wash my hands and then my phone vibrates. On my screen, I see Paul's number. Well, that's strange. Why would Paul be sending me a message if he's right in the next room talking to my girlfriend? I open my phone, only to become immediately petrified. Hey guys, sorry for the delay. My car broke down on the road. I'll be there in about 15 to 20 minutes. I saw the message was sent only 1 minute ago. I quickly realized that if Paul had broken down his car, then the man that was with us was not Paul at all. I was in a total panic. I came out of the bathroom and tried to keep a poker face as best as I could. This false Paul asked me if I was okay. I told him yes and asked my girlfriend to come with me to unload the car. I was planning to leave right away and notify the police without this stranger noticing anything. Problem was, as soon as we went to leave, this fake Paul insisted on helping us unload. I told myself he might try to do something to us once our suitcases were brought inside. An attack? A theft? Who knows? I got in on his game and told him to stay at the foot of the elevator so we could take the suitcases to him and he could bring them up to the apartment while my girlfriend and I unloaded the car. Thankfully, he was fooled. My girlfriend and I went downstairs while Paul waited for the suitcases as planned. Arriving on the ground floor, I hastened to tell my girlfriend everything and even showed her the message as well. She really started panicking. I then told her the best thing to do was call the police and then join up with the real Paul. My girlfriend called the police and explained the situation to them, while I also called Paul and asked if he was coming soon. The police said they would arrive on scene in 10 minutes. I took my car with my girlfriend inside and parked it on the street opposite the residence, just in case the false Paul came down to get us. The real Paul sent me a message telling us he had arrived. We joined him and immediately I felt reassured. The man in front of me really inspired me with some confidence. He was very professional. We decided to tell him the whole story very quickly. He immediately understood our dismay. He told us he thought he knew who the man was who was pretending to be him. It would be a man named Lorenzo who lived in an apartment located in the same residence as Paul. Lorenzo was a tenant who caused many problems, according to him. The police arrived and we decided to take them to the residence directly. Arriving at the parking lot, we see a silhouette in the distance though. It was Lorenzo. When he saw the police, he went completely crazy. He began insulting us, saying everything was our fault, and that it had really now come to this. His speech was incomprehensible. He was going berserk. The police arrested him after a struggle, and we didn't hear from Lorenzo for 3 days. In the meantime, Paul moved us into his real apartment, which matched the photos perfectly and was very clean. The police called us 3 days after. It turns out Lorenzo had lost his job due to the health crisis, and his landlord had evicted him from the apartment in which he was staying for non-payment of rent. In addition, Lorenzo seemed to have an addiction to some kind of drug, which explained his mood swings. The police think that Lorenzo wanted to steal as many valuable items as possible from us to resell them, or possibly worse. He was placed under police surveillance while a doctor came to establish a behavioral diagnosis. And so, that's my story. Apart from those events, our vacation actually went really well, even if we were really freaked out at the time, and even a little during the rest of the vacation, I'll admit. This story is to tell you to be careful when renting something out in a place you don't know anyone. Always ask for a photo of the owner of the property. Thankfully, the real Paul was a nice guy, but you never know. I hope this story can help you all one day. For context, my name is Benjamin. At the time, I was 14 years old. I lived in a small village with my parents, my sister, and my dog. It all started during the summer holidays, during the month of July. It was the middle of the afternoon. I had an old laptop, and I wasn't really paying attention to the sites I was going to. What I mean is I was going to lots of unsecured websites, and on websites where you weren't supposed to be if you were under 18 years old. All of a sudden, my computer restarted by itself. On the blue screen, there was a message supposedly from the police, telling me that if I did not pay by bank card an amount of 300 euros within a maximum period of 15 days, I would have problems with the law. Needless to say, I was in a panic. I restarted my PC, but this message was still there. I didn't know what to do. In my panic, I called my father, who was out in the garden. I was in tears. I was imagining all sorts of bad things happening. He came to check on me with my mother and asked me what I was so upset about. I explained to them and tried to reassure myself, seeing as I was panicking. My uncle was very knowledgeable on computers, so he completely reset my PC for me, and there was no more message. 2 weeks later, as luck would have it, something else happened. It was a Saturday afternoon where the weather was very nice. All the windows and doors were open, and my dog was in the garden. I was home with my father, my sister, and my dog. My mother was out working. My father had to quickly go to the optician in the village, 10 minutes away by car from my house. He had to grab his new glasses. My father left, telling me that in less than 30 minutes he would be back. I found myself at home with my sister and my dog now. As my luck would have it, 5 minutes after his departure, the phone began to ring. I was very shy and didn't often answer the phone myself. I don't know why this time I decided to do it. A lady was on the phone. I only understood half of what she was saying to me, but she began talking to me explicitly about the message I'd had on my PC. I was paralyzed on the phone. "Don't move from your house. We're coming right now." I'd never told them my address. She hung up. I was stuck for 30 seconds. I had a realization. I ran outside to get my dog. I also called my sister and told her to close all the windows and shutters. She didn't really understand what was going on. She was 5 years younger than me. She saw I was serious though and listened to me right away. 2 minutes later, everything was closed and locked up tight. I started telling myself that I was simply making a fuss over nothing. I didn't really need to call my father. Maybe they were just messing with me to try and get money out of me or something. Nobody was going to come to my house over this. All of a sudden though, the doorbell started to ring. I started to panic. My dog started to bark. She was well trained, so I made her stop, and I told my sister not to make a single noise. It was a distressing moment. They kept ringing over and over again, and we had no way of checking to see who this was without them seeing us as well. In the meantime, I told my sister and my dog to hide under the bed in my sister's room. Eventually, the doorbell did stop ringing. Small clarification, we had closed the shutter of my sister's room but not closed the window all the way, so we could hear the noise from outside. There was a stone path at my house, and we heard the sound of the stones when we walked on them. We could hear someone walking out there right now. Even my young sister understood how serious this was now. We cried without making any noise. The house telephone was on the opposite side of where we were. We heard people knocking on the window shutter several times, shouting to open it. We could hear them circling the house once more. Then we didn't hear anything else. After a while, I took my courage in both hands. I emerged from that room without making any noise just in case. I called my father in tears, telling him to come home right now. Someone was trying to get into our home. He tried to reassure me by saying he was hurrying home right now. He called my neighbor to come help us and to see what was happening to be sure before calling the police. When she arrived, no one was there. My father arrived 2 minutes later. I explained everything to him. He looked at the call history, and it was a hidden number. I know he believed me because when he left, he was sure he had closed the gate of the house, which was now wide open outside. Since then, I've spoken about this incident to 2 to 3 people at maximum, and with my parents, of course. We've never spoken about it again, and we never received any more news about this story. Because of this incident, though, I was traumatized. I can't stand being alone at home. So yeah, that's my little anecdote. I don't know if anyone will really hear this, but what happened to me was so crazy that I had to tell it.